Hi, I'm Phil Walker. I co-produce this show with Wendy, and I'm stepping in today to ask for your support. As a small nonprofit, the Mind and Life Institute depends on the generosity of donors like you, who allow us to offer this show freely and without advertisements. Your support also helps us provide vital resources to foster new research and to educate, connect, and inspire the most innovative thinkers in contemplative science. If you're able to make a donation of any amount, we'd be most grateful. You can do so at mindandlife.org/give. Thank you so much for supporting our work. And from all of us here at Mind and Life, please take care and enjoy the show.
The amount of polarization and the amount of divides are tremendous. And so I think that the field needs to become more translational to really bring what we have developed in the lab and is working into the society at large so that we can really counteract that, right? Because it is undermining our democracies, it is undermining our humanity. You know, we have a loneliness epidemic already in young people, and I think we have a responsibility to do something about it, which is not just staying in your lab, but translating these approaches to really support society and democracy right now.
Welcome to Mind and Life. I'm Wendy Hasenkamp. Today I'm speaking with social neuroscientist Tania Singer. Tania is a world leader in studying empathy and compassion, and her pioneering work shines a light on the interpersonal aspects of the brain and contemplative practice. We cover a lot of ground in this conversation, but I also feel like we barely scratched the surface of Tania's work. We start with her landmark studies exploring how empathy works in the brain, and then get into the wonderful story of her collaboration with Buddhist monk Matthieu Ricard, also a guest on the show, and the powerful insights that emerged for both of them through that research. Tania describes the critical difference between empathy and compassion, and how empathy for others' suffering can easily lead to burnout, whereas compassion can help us build resilience. We discuss her, frankly, incredible longitudinal research project that separated different aspects of meditation, enabling her to study the specific effects of training in attention, emotion, and perspective taking. Her results show that what you practice really matters for our brains and bodies and behavior. We also talk about her use of contemplative dyads across many different settings. That is, practicing in a structured way with another person, and how this style of practice can form a kind of social glue, strengthening interpersonal bonds and creating psychological safety. The impact of Tania's work in contemplative science is honestly hard to overstate. Her decades of research have really moved the needle in our understanding and value of compassion, and more broadly, the social side of human experience. As always, check the show notes for lots more on Tania's work, including a link to a wonderful essay she wrote for our Insights project on contemplative dyads. Okay, I hope you enjoy this one as much as I did. I'm so happy to share with you Tania Singer. It is such a pleasure to welcome Tania Singer to the show today. Hey, Tania, welcome, and thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Wendy. It's wonderful to be with you.
I'm really excited to get into the broad scope of your work. I feel like, you've done so many different things over the years, ranging from social neuroscience and biomarkers and psychology and behavior. But I feel like a lot of it really centers on kind of understanding the interpersonal side of human life. So I'm just wondering, for a little bit of background, if you could share some of how you got interested in those topics.
Yeah, I guess I am from my heart what I'm now, a social neuroscientist. And the focus is on social, right? I think I was fascinated my whole life long about how social interactions, how social brains, how the social works. And, I studied psychology, and I started as a developmental psychologist and, cognitive psychologist. But then I made a shift when I went from Germany to London. And then I kind of entered this very emerging field of social neuroscience. When I entered it, it was just emerging. It was just, the first papers which were called, the emergence of social neuroscience around 2000. And why I was attracted to this new field, or like even co-creating it somehow with, first empathy studies I did there, I guess is rooted very long time back in my infancy, right? Because I was born as a monozygotic identical twin.
Oh, yeah.
So I was born as a we, right? I was born with a person in the belly already together, like non-verbally interacting in one way or the other. We had a twin language before my parents could understand us. We understood each other in a very probably primitive way, but still. And I guess when I became psychologist, I was always a bit frustrated that the focus was so much on, just cognition, the individual.
Yeah.
Of course, there was social psychology, there was environmental psychology, cultural psychology. So there was things out there, but for sure in neuroscience, it was very, very much the beginning of, imaging and non-invasive neuroscience. And so the focus was all on cognition and language and, like primary motor abilities, and not about us and the we and the social and, and so I really was like, there's something missing, right? We need to kind of fill this gap. And so this is how I became a social neuroscientist and started, looking for ways how you can do scanning and brain imaging work on topics like social emotion, like empathy, compassion, cooperation, and things which are not, at that time, has not been typically investigated in neuroscience.
Yeah. I love that. And just thinking about your whole life experience as a twin and how that's impacted the way that you view all this. Maybe we can start a little bit with your early work on, you did some landmark studies on understanding empathy in the brain, and then also thinking about some really interesting interactions with Mathieu Ricard, the famous meditator who helped your investigations into compassion as well. So I'd love to hear some of those stories.
Yeah, so the first story you kind of referred to is actually the first empathy study we did within the scanner environment. So you have to imagine, I was a postdoc in London at the Wellcome Department of Imaging Neuroscience, right? Incredible good research institution, which really had kind of pioneered, you could say, non-invasive brain imaging using fMRI, no functional magnetic resonance imaging, like, non-invasive brain scans, right? And so here I was working with Chris Friss, the first, I think, really investigator in the world, I would say, had investigated something like what we call theory of mind. Theory of mind is how do you understand thoughts or like intention, beliefs of others, right? And he was the pioneer in asking this question the first time in neuroscience, not just psychology, where this research was already out there, right? Developmental psychology and, when does this capacity to really understand that other people might have other thoughts, beliefs, and so on, when does it emerge in development? When does it emerge in evolution? Or do great apes have that? So this research was out, but nobody had ever done any testing in the brain. Do we have some modules or some specific networks which are only tuned to process, beliefs about other people? And so in a way, that was the beginning of a very important string in social neuroscience, meaning, how does the other person get into our brain? How do I understand your thoughts if I'm not you?
Yeah.
Right? How do I get there? How does our brain solve this problem? Now, for me, being a very, emotional person and, as a twin, always somehow in emotional resonance with my twin, and I'm sensing a lot what other people feel. I'm very hyper empathic, you could say. I'm sensing in the womb what's happening and so on. So I was much more interested in how do we get to understand feelings of the other, right? How do I know that you're suffering or happy? And why do I feel it so strongly when others are happy and suffering, but I'm not in your body?
Yeah.
No, I'm not in your emotions. And that was the question I posed, but it was not so easy because the scanner environment is super non-social, right? You're you can't move, you're only alone in this brain scanner, and then there's some video stimulus shown to you, there's some language or some, and then you have to tap on a keypad, yes, no. So how do you measure empathy in that environment, right? So this took quite a while, and we came up with the pain empathy paradigm. And I remember first I needed to figure out how pain in the brain is actually processed. And the interesting thing is that when you do imaging neuroscience, to have reliable data, you need, for example, in emotions, right? You need to show at least 21 times some fear-evoking stimulus in a row, right?
Right. So you have some repetition.
So that you have repetition and you can process the data. So with emotion research, not so easy, right? If you're once in a bad mood, you cannot just step in and step out and step in again and step out, right? You're just in it. So there was this problem first. So the pain research was basically the genius, let's say, domain, because you can apply with some pain electrodes to your hand like a bee sting type of electrical shock stimuli on your hand, which it feels like a bee sting, but without consequences. Mm-hmm. But it activates what we call in the brain the pain network. And this pain network processes all kind of aspect of pain, right? Like, where was this shock? Was it on your left or right hand? Was it intense or not? Was it like burning or more peaking, right? So you have these different sensomotor components. And then you have an affective component of pain. That's the actual emotional component. You know, the ow. You know, the ow component, the component, ouch, this hurts. Ow,
like that hurts.
Ow, that hurts. This is unpleasant, right? The feeling of unpleasantness, which usually we think this is pain, right? But pain is much more complex. And so pain has all these different components. And so what we did is to develop a paradigm where for the first time you were not scanned alone, but there was another person in the scanner environment. And that was a whole tricky issue to do because the scanner is like a super sensitive camera, no? And in the moment where someone moves next to the scanner, you get spikes, you get artifacts in the picture, right? It's like a photo picture would be blurred. So we had to find a way where the person next to the scanner getting also painful shock to the hand was sitting very, very quiet and watching through a kind of a video stimuli screen, knowing, okay, now the person in the scanner gets a shock or now it's me getting a shock. So there were like projected on a certain screen, there were like flashes either pointing to me being scanned, lying there, and then I would say, oh, in 3 seconds I get, a bee sting. Or I would see a flash pointing to my partner who was sitting next to the scanner. I couldn't see the face or so, but I would know, okay, now my partner is suffering this bee sting, right?
This shock, yeah.
But my brain and my body would not get any what we call nociceptive input, right? I would not get any pain. I would just know abstractly, oh, now my partner is zapped.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so you have to imagine at that time, people like, senior professors said, Tania, this is crazy. What you are doing is really crazy because you will measure an empty brain, right? What you are measuring is something which is happening outside of the scanner to another person which is not even scanned, and nothing comes into your system. So why would you see something in your brain? So at that time, I was like, because I feel it, right? I feel,
of course,
I feel that my partner is zapped and I feel something. I'm like, oh, ow. Right? Because I know how it feels for myself too.
Yeah.
But you can't imagine the people were not believing that you would see something. They would say you will measure empty brains, meaning nothing will be seen.
You wouldn't see any signal, yeah.
But what we saw was amazing. It was like the brain was lighting up like a Christmas tree. It was really, really a lot of activation you could see. And the interesting thing is that when you compare that with the pain matrix, imagine I get pain, right? And there is a pain matrix activated in my brain. It's not the whole pain matrix which gets reactivated if my partner is in pain. So if I empathize with the pain of my partner, I only activate the emotional component of pain. So I only reactivate the networks in my brain which codes for the the emotional aversion of pain. And evolutionary, it makes a lot of sense because imagine I would see my partner, being burned on her hand or his hand, and then my hand would burn. Doesn't make a lot of sense evolutionary, right? But it makes a lot of sense that I'm feeling for my partner like, ow, that hurts, because then I know I need to do something about it, right?
Right.
very likely this person will suffer, it will run out, I can do something about it, right? So it gives me the information about the saliency, the valence, and this is what we call empathy, right? We feel with the other person, we feel the pain of the other, but the emotional component of this pain.
Yeah. Thank you. That was a really great explanation. And so I know then you kind of evolved into understanding the difference between empathy and compassion. Can you describe how that happened?
Yeah, that is the second question. Okay, so that was the beginning, right? That was the first empathy study in neuroscience, social neuroscience. It got published in Science, and a lot of people were like, oh my God, our brains are wired to be empathic, and that's amazing. And so in the second phase was then to understand, but why are we actually not such an empathic civilization? If we are all wired, right? To be resonating, and the brain does that almost automatically in milliseconds. And, so why are we not such a super always empathic society? So there was a second phase of studies where it was more about the modulation, the plasticity of these empathic signals, right? So I started looking at a lot of different factors which modulate these empathic brain responses. So, for example, I put actors in the scanner, and they were either, so-called football fans from the rival team of the person scanned, right? So, we looked at in-group, out-group factors. So if you think that, a rival football team, you are a football fan, right? And someone is zapped now with pain, which is not your partner anymore, but it is either someone from your football team or someone from the other team, what you will see is that you have an empathic brain response if it's the person you think is your football fan in-group member. But if the other one, if it's an out-group member, like the rival football team member, which you think it is just actors, right? But you thought that this was true, then you have no empathy left, right? In 1 second you have empathy, in the next there's no empathy left. And you have schadenfreude, you have reward signals, which actually rejoice of this rival football team actually receiving pain.
Yeah, this is the great German word schadenfreude, which we also use in English, meaning like the pleasurable feelings that you get when you see someone that you don't like
exactly
in pain or having some suffering.
Yeah, so you basically see schadenfreude like the reward, as we also call it shameful joy, no? Because you are rejoicing of the pain or suffering of another because you either the other was unfair to you, or it was an out-group member, or whatever. You have a negative attribution. And so we could show in many, many studies in other labs too later what I call then the fragility of empathy, right? Empathy is coming and going in a way. It's an emotion, right? It's phasic. It's like building up and it's going away again. And it is usually triggered by some outside stimuli, right? Like because you read something, because you see something, video and news, so on. So it's phasic, it's an emotion. And it is fragile, as we could see, right? It can come in 1 millisecond because you like the person, because it's an in-group member, because it's belonging to your identity, it's a family group, and but then next second it can be gone because someone was, not fair to you, or someone said it's someone from another religion or so on. So at the time when we started to understand the difference between empathy and compassion, I was motivated to do the next step and to say, can we train empathy? Can we make it more stable, right? Can we really practice to become more empathic person? And at that time, I had not understood the difference between empathy and compassion. I just thought, well, if it's so fragile, can we do something to train it so that it becomes stable, right? For in-group, for out-group member, for everyone. And usually, as you know, when you do plasticity research in neuroscience, meaning, is our brain trainable? Mm-hmm. You go and you look for experts. So cognitive neuroscientists who were interested in motor plasticity, right? What they did, they looked for violinists or pianists who had done thousands of hours of piano training or violin training. And then they look whether the areas in the brain representing the fingers become thicker with experience, right? With expertise. So I had the problem to have to look for experts in empathy.
Yes.
Who is doing thousands of hours of empathy. suffering, becoming more empathic. So that was a bit of a, where do I start, right? So by chance, right? Life is a lot by coincidence or whatever, fate. I was in the Himalaya at the same time where I published this empathy paper. And I was shooting a movie with my twin sister.
Aha.
And we happened to be close to the residence of the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala because we were shooting the overtone singing of the Gyuto monks. And so we happened to stumble into a Mind and Life conference, which was actually on plasticity.
Oh, my goodness.
And I was like, I didn't know about Mind and Life so far, and I wasn't aware that it was meeting there when we were there. So I was stuck like from a nighting. I was, what? All these colleagues I know, they are all in Dharamsala, in the hills of the Himalaya, talking about plasticity with His Holiness, with the incarnation of compassion, and I was working on empathy. So I was like, oh my God, that is so crazy. And when I came back, I contacted Richie Davidson and the Mind and Life Institute, and I proposed to them and said, can I do and propose a conference on the brain circuitry for empathy and compassion? Because it was just emerging. At that time, there wasn't so much research on it, right, in neuroscience. It was just the first papers coming out. So Mathieu Ricard, who is the translator of the Dalai Lama for French, and he is a long-term Buddhist practitioner, and he is also a best-selling author, a photographer, and he was a researcher in his former life. He's a French biochemist. So
yes,
he kind of got aware of my science paper, of the empathy paper, and independently of me reaching out at the same time in my life, he contacted me in London. He would be in London whether he could meet me. He would like to meet me and talk about the empathy study.
Wow.
So I invited him into the London Brain Imaging Center. I know that this was the first time a Buddhist monk in robe would basically enter the functional imaging lab of the Wellcome Department in Neuroscience.
Sure.
They were all looking like, what is Tania bringing here, into a neuroscience meeting. At that time, there was no real contemplative science, right? It's just very early days. And I remember how, we got friends immediately, and he was immediately fascinated by the work. And so he became a guinea pig. And so when I moved from London to Zurich, because I became assistant professor there, I wrote a grant and we started investigating with real-time fMRI, which is a technique which allows you to really look at the brain images while someone is scanned, not just reconstructing them over months after a scan is done. But with real-time fMRI, I could have Mathieu Ricard, the monk, in the scanner doing different types of meditation, right? I had found my expert, my compassion empathy expert.
Yes.
And so I put him into the scanner. For 2 days he was with us. And I just asked him to do the most incredible things you would never dare to ask any naive subject, right? I said, could you go 30% into disgust, 60% in love, 30% in compassion, 90% into anger, and so on. So that was really fascinating because we could see how these networks came on and off, and, it was really fascinating.
Yeah.
And this is where I understood the difference between empathy and compassion, because what happened is that I asked him second day, can you now just imagine the suffering? He had seen a video in the night before in a hotel room. It was about real big suffering of children in an orphanage in Romania, I think. And it was just horrible. It was like, almost autistically walking. They had hunger, right? They were so thin. It was just heartbreaking pictures of children suffering. And he imagined these pictures while he was in the scanner, and I was asking him to go into these different compassion meditation. At that time, I thought it's the same, empathy, compassion, right? So I thought I would see an expert in action empathizing with this absolute suffering of these children. And so I expected to see the empathy for pain network I had seen hundreds of times in my earlier empathy experiment with pain, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't see anything lighting up like that. But instead, when he entered into compassion, loving kindness, all these meditations, he showed a network. And this network is known to be associated to rewards, to positive feeling of warmth, of love. And I was like, okay, what is he doing, right? What is he not suffering with these children? Is he thinking about his dessert because we were before lunch? And I was like, he's probably just tired. So I told him, Mathieu, I think we have to get you out of the scanner. I'm not really sure what you're doing, but you're not really suffering, right? And then he was like, yeah, you did not ask me to suffer with these children. You said I should enter into compassion, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, but what are you then doing? I don't understand.
Right.
So we got him out, and we had a long discussion about what he's actually feeling if he goes into compassion. And he said, look, this is not suffering with someone. It is getting into the state of unconditional love and the motivation to really wish the other well and to really have this caring motivation of concern. And that was mind-blowing for me. I was like, wow, that's totally different than empathy, right, as we define it and observe it. So I asked him to go back into the scanner and to say, could you now, just for me to be sure you have a normal brain, could you go back and just do empathy as a normal brain would do it, right?
What you meant by empathy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like you just empathize, you just go into resonance, you just feel the suffering of these children, you just go with it. First, he said, like, why should I do that? I'm like, for science, right? He didn't understand the kind of, ethical reason. And then it was an extreme, no? We could see the pain matrix lighting up again.
The same that you had seen in your other participants, yeah.
Yeah, and it was very, very strong and clear. And so I knew, okay, he can do empathy. And then the really interesting thing came up, well, the discovery in a way for both of us, because then I said, okay, now I know you can do empathy, right, if it's instructed correctly, and we have no lost in translation anymore. We know what we're speaking of now. You want to go out now. And he's like, no, I'm burning out here. It is absolutely unbearable. I need to do some blocks, if possible, of loving kindness and compassion, also for my own sake, right? I'm burning out here.
It was so unpleasant for him.
Yeah, he said literally I was burning out of empathic distress, right? What Batson called empathic distress is when it becomes so unbearable, the pain of the other to you, that it becomes your own pain, your own distress, right? So then we asked him to go in loving kindness, compassion, and then we saw this other network coming up again, right? This is what we call now affiliation and care network. It's a evolutionary, very old network as well, which supports, altruism and unconditional love of, father, mother to their child, for example. This concern, this love, this altruistic motivation. And so that was really amazing. And when he came out, he was like, oh my God, I never, ever had this distinction. I mean,
oh, wow.
When you first do empathy, it becomes so much more relevant to actually train compassion, because you first time feel how empathy is good, but if it's too strong, it can lead you into empathic distress, right? If you lose this healthy self-other distinction, you can enter into this personal distress, and then you are lost, right? You're not of help for anybody. And then if you change into compassion, total different system, and we could see that in the brain, a total different system was lighting up.
Can I also ask just one question about that, the different networks? So the network that was active when he was doing the compassion, you mentioned that there was some aspects of reward in there. That's different, though, than the schadenfreude type of experience or network that you had seen in your other work of like outgroup?
Yeah, the problem is a little bit that with imaging, you cannot really distinguish whether the positive feeling in this network are dopamine-driven reward, right? Like this kind of high arousal, yeah, I want more, grasping, learning signal, or whether this is more opiate and oxytocin-related reward, which is more calming, soothing, caring, affiliative. They are both in the same network. So if you see nucleus accumbens lighting up or medial orbitofrontal and so on, you know that you are likely in a network which has to do with positive emotions. And we can only really know if you also ask the person, right?
Exactly, yeah.
It needs to be also always correlated with subjective reports, which we did also with Mathieu, but also later we did a lot of studies with naive people, white students from Zurich, to replicate these data, but in naive students, not like with, long-term expert Buddhist monks. So we started doing the first training study, can you take any student and train them into empathy and then train them into compassion, and do we find the same networks again? And there we always ask, how much positive feelings did you feel and how much negative feelings did you feel? So we asked them to also describe the quality of their feelings. And we could see that after compassion training, right, like after this activation of care systems through loving kindness and compassion, positive feelings got stronger, and qualitatively they were reported more like warmth, love, concern, not like high arousal. It is more like calming, soothing, warm feelings. And when you go in empathy and you train empathy, and you are exposed to these negative pictures, you see negative affect going up. So it was very clear that we could replicate that this network, which we call now the compassion-related network, right, is associated to feeling of positive affect, warmth, concern, love, and that the other network, which is this alarm, pain network, is associated to increased negative affect.
I love this story because I think it really highlights so many things that are critical in contemplative science, one of which is the absolute need for, like you said, that subjective report of the person in the scanner. What are they actually experiencing, and not just looking at their brain and making some assumptions, which is a huge problem in neuroscience. And then also the incredible benefit that can come, from conversations between these experts in contemplative traditions and scientists. It sounds like both of you came away with really new understandings of an area that you were both expert in, in your own ways. I love how that bridge really developed things. And then that work became so foundational for the field at large. I think it really spurred a lot of conversations and understanding about the difference between empathy and compassion, and you continue to do so much work in that. So maybe just for the listeners to just kind of say succinctly, how do you think about it now, the difference between empathy and compassion, and then does empathy, is it still required for compassion, or how do they kind of play together?
Yeah, so, this discovery obviously led to decades of research. And also the next stage of that research in my life was to start developing secular training programs to investigate basically plasticity of empathy, compassion, perspective taking. So, can we train the social brain with, different mental contemplative exercise, but in a secular way, and do research out of it. So the resource project, at that time, it was one of the longest, in the domain of contemplative science, because we went over the typical 8-week MBSR or like 8-week MBCT or self-compassion to 9 months. And so in one module, we tried to really teach people how to distinguish the difference between empathy when they basically start moving into empathic distress, so that they can also distinguish between healthy empathy and empathic distress, because that has been, when you discover things, then the press comes and messes everything up. Sorry, but, I became constantly like, Tania says empathy is bad and compassion is good. And then I was cited like that by, for example, in Bloom's book, Against Empathy, right? The title is Against Empathy. So all people against empathy. And I was cited as a Mathieu studies, for the purpose of compassion is better. So I always say, no, it's not true. Empathy and compassion are two different things. Empathy has a very important function. So if you would not have any empathic resonance, you would likely be a psychopath, right? You would not know that someone is suffering. You would not know the intensity someone is suffering. Empathy can also be related to joy, empathic joy, right? It is a social glue. If you empathize with the joy of the other, it's a glue, it's a social cohesion glue, right? So empathy has huge amount of functions, evolutionary functions, social functions. So it is really important that we have empathy. The thing is that empathy is more fragile, right? It can, but it doesn't have to, move into empathic distress. And what happens in empathic distress is that, say you have so much empathy, perhaps because you love so much the person, it's your baby, right? And it's crying and you feel so helpless. Then you become, as mother, so distressed that you start getting really stressed or even perhaps crying. But that, can you imagine, doesn't help your baby, which just cries, right? If the mother starts crying and then they loop and spiral upwards and nobody's helped, right? Because it's all about the mother's distress now and she needs to regulate her own distress and so on. So that's when healthy empathy moves into empathic distress, or what is also called personal distress, because it becomes personal in the sense that the definition we have suggested for empathy, also to avoid equating empathy with emotion contagion, is emotion contagion. I catch your emotion, right? Your stress, but I'm not aware that you are the source of my stress.
Ah, okay.
You are stressed. I'm contagious by your emotion, but I'm not even aware that you were the cause of it. I'm just stressed. And the whole room then, perhaps, right? Emotion contagion doesn't have a self-other distinction. Empathy is also feeling with, right? You are stressed, I feel the stress of you, but I am aware that you are the source of the stress. I'm aware that I'm vicariously feeling your pain or stress, but it's not mine. So I have a healthy self-other distinction in empathy, which in emotion contagion is not there. So, for example, babies and animals have emotion contagion even before a sense of self emerge. And in some animal, they may never have a sense of self, right? So only when the self-other distinction really emerged in childhood, you can develop empathy, which is very early, like 2 years of age or even earlier. But that's very important. And in empathic distress, this healthy self-other distinction vanishes again. Meaning, I'm not aware anymore that I'm just suffering with you, but it's not my feeling. It becomes my trauma, or it activates my trauma, my distress, or so on. And then it becomes my emotion, and I'm like so identified with it that I have to regulate it, I have to take care of it, I'm getting distressed. And this empathic distress can lead to burnout if you have that all the time, right? So what we try now to teach people in these modules, in these training modules we developed, is how to recognize healthy empathy, how to regulate healthy empathy so that it doesn't go into empathic distress. And if they are too much in empathic distress, how to move through self-compassion first, right? If you're already totally distressed, you first have to take care of your own distress. And then you can move out again and go into compassion. So we are teaching people how to go from empathy into compassion, how to switch from one system in the other system, and how the difference is in feeling, right? And it's just amazing. I mean, one thing is that we know about the different brain circuitry and so on. Once you do these exercises with the people, I've done it with thousands of people in retreats now, you see it in their face and their posture and everything. I can tell you from outside whether they are in empathy or in compassion. It's a totally different posture, it's a different type of resilience, of openness, of heart in compassion, right? It's a different face expression. It's really just a different system altogether.
And how would you define compassion now?
Compassion is, as Paul Gilbert also stresses always, right? It is a motivation and not an emotion. So it's not coming and going, and it's not feeling with, it's feeling for. So it is actually a motivation. It's in the care system. So it's an altruistic motivation. You want the welfare of the other. You don't necessarily have to feel with the other or even feel love for the other. I mean, it's nice if a feeling of love emerge out of this motivation. But compassion is much more a motivation, an intention that you wish the welfare of the other, that you want to do something for the welfare of the other, that you wish the other well, right? It's an intention and a motivation. And sometimes it comes with feelings of love and warmth and positive, but it doesn't have to, right? If you train and practice it, you don't always have to fall in love with the other, right? That's not what it is.
Right.
You just go into this other motivation, which is really altruistic. It's really about the other. It's not about you wanting to be liked or you want to, it's really about, may the other be well, right? May the other not suffer anymore. How can I help? I'm really concerned about your welfare, right? I'm concerned that your suffering be taken away from you. It doesn't mean that you have to go into action, right? Compassion is a motivation, which is a precursor of any action or not, right? You can have compassion without acting, right? You can have compassion like Mathieu in the scanner where he wasn't asked to act. So compassion is a motivation, but it is a precursor for action and for prosocial and helping, right?
Yeah.
And that's making it so strong. And the other thing, it is very resilient. It really protects you from empathic distress and burnout. It's really resilient because it is soothing you, no? When you are activating the care and soothing system in yourself, you are like happy. Like, Mathieu, he asked me, can I please do some loving kindness?
Right, to soothe.
To soothe himself because he was so distressed, right? It was his own therapy. But at the same time, compassion for others is obviously a win-win situation because for the other, it's wonderful to receive the love and this strong, caring attitude towards this person. But at the same time, you have a clear self-other distinction as well, right? You are clear. There is more distance than in empathy. In empathy, you're more like moving back and forth with the other, like instruments together, right? In compassion, you're more like a warm, loving stone in the ocean, not moving. Whatever the other is going through, you're just like this kind of loving, warm-hearted stone, furry.
Like a groundedness.
Yeah, like a groundedness, like something which is really stable. It's a stable motivation, right? And that is why we are now teaching nurses and all kind of people in different training modules how to recognize, distinguish these phenomena, right? Emotion, contagion, empathy, empathic distress, compassion. How to move from one system to the other. How to regulate empathy if it's becoming too much. How to use self-compassion to come out of this, if you have ended up into distress, no? How can you use compassion first to yourself so that then you can move to other related compassion, right? And then you are off the hook again.
Yeah. Well, it's so needed in our society. I'm thinking back to your earlier comment about after your initial empathy research, why are we not an empathic society? So it sounds like it's more of a compassion deficit necessarily than maybe an empathy deficit.
Yeah, sometimes probably we have too much empathy. If you're exposed every day to this horrific news and then, if you don't know how to regulate it or how to switch in the right moment to compassion if it becomes too much, either you get distant, cynical, you kind of, you get numb because you have to protect yourself. So I think there is really a lot to do in this domain, no? And also I'm starting to work a lot with medical doctors and healthcare system people. Really, they don't know at all about the differences. They have a very gross understanding of something very general called empathy, which is more or less everything which is understanding the other. It's not very refined, right?
Right. Yeah, I think the public sphere doesn't have this distinction that has emerged really in large part thanks to your work in contemplative science too. So I think it's so important to be able to share that in so many domains. So I'm excited to talk about, how your work has evolved and is being applied now. So you started to mention kind of the next phase in this really ambitious project that you undertook, which still kind of blows my mind, a very large and long-term longitudinal study, which is called the Resource Project and had several different arms and a whole bunch of different outcome measures and many, many participants. So would you be able to give us a glimpse of what that was like?
Yeah. So in a way, this resource project was more like a lifetime project because I think I started writing the grant in 2008 and we are still publishing on it. We have more than 60 papers out. We had 300 people going through a 9 months intervention protocol, right? Like a training program. We had more than 90 different measures from brain measure, immune system, behavior, subjective measure, phenomenological measure. I mean, we really had it all. So it was a huge, huge project. And the goal was many, many different goals. Actually, at that time, I think the focus was very much on mindfulness, but more mindfulness in terms of attention-based cognitive mindfulness, right?
Right. In the field, that was mainly what was focused on.
Yeah, in the field. So can we increase attention? Can we increase monitoring? Can we decrease inhibition difficulties, regulation difficulties, and so on? And my feeling was, but there is also compassion and empathy out there, right? I was an empathy compassion researcher. So And then due to the Mind and Life dialogues with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and many other Buddhist monks and also other contemplative masters, there was another emphasis a lot on what we would call wisdom or, cognitive perspective taking. And we talked about that early in the interview. When I joined Chris Frith's lab in early 2000, he was working on this cognitive capacity, to take the perspective of another person and also of yourself, this metacognitive capacity. And because I had done so much work on dissecting the social brain, right? And at that point, I had understood the difference between networks for empathy, networks for compassion, networks for theory of mind, which were all different brain networks. And so I said, okay, if we do training study, we should be able to devise mental training practices, exercises, which are particularly good inducing plasticity in these different networks, right? It's not all the same. I took the metaphor of sports at that time and said, look, when people say, Tania Singer, can you tell me what meditation does? I say it's like you would ask a sport expert, what does sport do to your body?
Yeah.
You're like, yeah, likely sport will do something if you do it regular to your body, right? But then obviously every sport expert would say, which type of sport?
Sure.
Or let's say in a fitness club, you have these different machines, in which will train either your, muscles of the arms, of your legs, and very different, right? You would not expect your muscle getting bigger in your arms if you are on a machine every day doing your legs, no? So if you are doing everyday compassion and empathy exercise and care-based exercise, you would expect networks in the brain becoming thicker that are responsible for emotions and for empathy and compassion, and not some metacognitive mentalizing networks, which are responsible for theory of mind and perspective taking. And the same for attention, right? The attention network are other networks in the brain. So we started to develop 3 modules. One was a 3-month module just about mindfulness, like classic attention-based shamatha exercises, which are training the present moment attention, training basically also interoceptive body awareness, like breathing meditation or body scan, or things which were very popular and known already in the field, because MBSR and MBCT are heavily based on that. So we called that presence, and it was like you could say a classic mindfulness module, but without yoga, without any socio-emotional training. Mm-hmm. Then we had a socio-emotional module, which was basically training the care system. So everything which to do with social emotion like empathy, compassion, loving kindness, gratitude. So we were training this network. And then the 3rd module was called perspective, and that was aiming at training with specific exercises, this metacognitive, mentalizing, perspective-taking ability on self and others. And so we classified basically different meditation practice corresponding to the 3 modules. And for the first time in that phase of contemplative science, we could ask beyond just what is meditation doing. We could ask which type of exercise is doing what.
Yes.
And summarizing 60 or more papers, we actually got huge amount of evidence that it really matters what you practice. It really matters whether you do a 3 months heavily care-based compassion, or whether you do an attention-based mindfulness module, or whether you do this cognitive, socio-cognitive module, perspective taking. So we could find, for example, these mindfulness module were great in, enhancing working memory, attention, body awareness, present moment awareness, but they didn't do so much on compassion task or on, altruistic cooperation task. The theory of mind task, the difficult, these understanding beliefs of others, this very difficult cognitive task, only got enhanced when you went through these 3 months perspective-taking exercise. Not any other module, even though the compassion module is also about imagining a lot of other people, right, or doing diets with other people. It was interesting that they would not enhance theory of mind. It's very specific faculty. It's not just because you're training with another person or you're extending love to the other person that this perspective-taking faculty gets better. And we could see that on the brain level, we could see that on the behavioral level, we could see that on the hormonal level, on all kind of different levels. It really matters what you practice.
Yeah.
And so that was, I would say, the most fascinating, insight, that we just need to think more differentiated about this whole mental training field, and that we really have to look at what are we doing every day, right? Which type of exercise are we practicing?
Yeah, that's such a great kind of summary of an incredible amount of work. But I think that's such an important takeaway. And especially at the time, I know that you were devising this study, and even to a large extent today, certainly I think in the popular understanding, the term meditation is still a very kind of vague umbrella term, like you compared it to sports. And as we know, there's so many different kinds of practices. So this is such a beautiful demonstration of just the reality that what you practice is what gets better.
Yes.
And I think it's also, really we can extrapolate that too beyond meditation practices, but just thinking about like engaging on social media. If you are engaging in a really volatile or negative discourse all the time, like that's what you're practicing. That's what you're training, in fact.
Exactly. We could show when you engage every day in positive gratitude, right? So that we will talk about the diets perhaps later, right? That was a certain practice we introduced for the first time into the resource project, where we really did partner-based intersubjective meditations, right? Secular partner-based, where you had another person every day to practice with, either perspective taking or social emotion like empathy, gratitude, and so on, depending in which module you were. And I think really what you just said, if you really practice every day this loving kindness and gratitude and, activating your care and affiliative system, you will get all the benefits of practicing that. So meaning more positive emotions, more altruistic cooperation, more compassion, more tolerance, more social cohesion, all these beautiful resilience, optimism, right?
It's like it becomes woven into your default state a little bit, right? Is that a way to think about it? Like a baseline?
Yeah, it becomes almost like a personality trait, an attitude, a baseline, right? And it really changes a lot of, systems, not only in the hardware of your brain. We could show, I think, for the first time that we had structural plasticity changing after 3 months of a module. And not only that, you could actually change, brains of 43 years on average. It's not like children, right?
Right.
It's people where you think there's just brain atrophy. It's just the brain is getting thinner, but not thicker. And we could show that this getting thicker was very specific to the module you had trained. So you had thicker limbic and paralimbic structure after the compassion module. But in the same brain, 3 months later, you had thicker prefrontal and parietal networks, which subserve, cognitive capacity of mentalizing.
Oh, right, because the people did all the 3 trainings in different orders. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Amazing.
so you could basically see within a person how different networks in my brain would become thicker after 3 months of doing a specific type of practice, right? And that was quite revolutionary, because first, we were all trained that with 25, our brain just gets thinner and, atrophy, and then eventually you get Alzheimer or dementia. But to show that on average, 43-year-old up to 55 would grow networks, which are social brain networks, not like hardcore. It's really like what we would call soft skills, right? But it was actually hardware which was changing.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the brain structure. And then it would really matter what you practice. Now, after 3 months of compassion training, I just had more gray matter in my limbic and emotional networks. Same for attention. So I think that is good news, no? We can start late. We can just practice 20 to 30 minutes a day, not even too long, 3 months, and then we can already change our brain behavior, boost our mental health, immune system, and so on and so on.
Well, I want to make sure that we also talk, as you just mentioned, about your work with dyads. So I think this is really fascinating and something that emerged kind of out of this resource project too. So can you describe how that has evolved? And I guess maybe first starting with like, what is a contemplative dyad and how does that work?
Mm-hmm. So that was really also for me like another of these wow discovery in my life, no? Because I was a social neuroscientist, an identical twin in this intersubjective space. But I had always, when I was in retreats, meditated alone, right? I was sitting there like in mindfulness, meditating alone or doing exercise or mental practice alone. And then eventually in the time I was developing the resource project, for private reason, I was in Australia, and a friend of mine led a so-called Satori retreat. And I always wanted to see that also for my own curiosity and sake. So I subscribed to that. And that was a retreat where I wasn't sitting alone. I was sitting eye to eye with another person from morning 6 to evening 8, basically asking the other person, tell me who you are, tell me who you are, tell me who you are. It's like a kind of Zen-like practice, which was developed in the 70s with a psychoanalytic American, actually, in combination with Zen to this format. And I remember how looking into the eyes of this other person while exploring my inner self, who am I, was such a different thing than when I was sitting alone, right? It was so intimate and strong and personal but also inspiring, and it helped me concentrate and really stay there because this space, right, of these eyes looking at me was held like that. And I was so deeply touched by this exercise. And I thought, why are we actually training things like empathy, compassion, like social cognition or social emotion, which is social, right? It's by nature, it needs another person to feel compassion or to feel empathy. Why are we doing it alone or just imagining some people, which is sometimes really difficult to, keep imagery in your head? And so why are we not just doing it with another person? So I came back and I said to my developmental protocol group, hey, we have to include dyads. But we can't do it like in Satori, like this super intense expert retreat, We have to do it as a skill learning approach, science-based, informed by these modules and these different, socio-emotional, socio-cognitive. And we have to do it much shorter in a daily life. So that was another inspiration I had, is that typically I came from retreats, right? Like meditation retreat or other retreats. And then I was so happy and so sensitive. And then I came back to London Tube, right?
Yeah.
Or Berlin, like airport. It was just overwhelmingly, and
yes,
very quickly you forgot about all these factors, because you had to kind of close up again, protect yourself.
Yeah, the re-entry is very difficult. Yeah, from an intensive retreat. Yeah, it's such a shock to come back to the regular world, and then soon enough you kind of revert to the old ways,
to old habits and so on. And so for me, it became more and more a focus of how can we actually train these wonderful, wholesome capacity like empathy, compassion, mindfulness, and so on, in the real life of people, during your meetings, before, after your meetings, right? Like really in your work life, because this is where it's the most difficult, right? To be always nice and compassionate and relaxed and whatever, right? Because there is all the structural stress in the world and constraints. And I think everyone knows that, right? So I was like, with the diets, I was saying, can we take these diets as 12 to 13 minutes mini exercises outside of a retreat context? We learn it in a retreat context, we teach it in a retreat context so that we learn how to do it. But then can we do it every day in our daily life as a exercise, but with another person? And we really wanted to also train something like, shared humanity, common humanity. So I also came up with the idea to change partner every week. So the differences between dyadic inquiry approach, which later I discovered that diets are sometimes also used in other settings, but that was much later, which is called inquiry method, where you say, take a partner and then, in a retreat, and then perhaps we visit basically the experience of this meditation. What did it do to your body?
Oh, yeah.
Right? And then the partner is not supposed to interrupt. So it's the same
Like a mindful listening. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a mindfulness dialogue or contemplative practice, right? Because the listener is never supposed to say anything to interrupt, just like mindfully listen. But the big difference from all these approaches where you do partner exercise in a retreat context and what we developed for the resource project is that we took this method as a skill learning approach and put it into the daily life over weeks. So like in a sport studio, right? You do always the same diet with the same questions. And the questions are not just some random question which are just made up in the moment, but they are science-based, right? We have always 2 questions, for example, for activating the care system and the affect module of resource, the socio-emotional. We have always the question in diet, tell me a difficult situation and how this feel in your body. Yeah, so you are like learning to accept difficult emotion and to identify them in your body as bodily feelings. And then the second question is always the antidote to the first question. It's always yin and yang. It's now tell me a situation where you felt gratitude and how did gratitude feel in your body? Because gratitude is activating this affiliative care system, this resilient positive care system. And then it can also somehow neutralize, let's say, if the difficult emotion were too strong, right? It can, so you never end a diet in kind of turmoil, right? And so this is how the affect diet came out. So summarizing the feature of our diet approach as unique, right, is that is a skill learning approach. You do the same diet over weeks daily so that really these networks in the brain can really develop, right? It's a skill learning approach. Then you have 2 questions which are science-based and not some kind of, they are like always yin and yang. They are developing specific faculties, yeah? Then you have changing partners every week and randomly assigned partners so that you develop shared humanity, tolerance, and like peace work.
Yeah.
And then you have a coaching session. So that became very, very important too. You have teachers, like in MBSR, you have a real teacher training. It's not something like, here you go, because you can imagine how personal it is and how safe the space has to be you build so that people can really share the most profound, vulnerable emotions every day of their life and really feel safe that the other will not say anything, not do anything, never speak about it. And that needs a lot of rules and do's and don'ts and coaching and building up, and also the safety of teachers accompanying you. So when we do this diet program, we don't like just throw the questions at someone and say, do it. We are really having a whole 8 to 10 week course or 3 months, like in Resource Project. And we have teachers accompanying you every week with online coaching session or real life coaching session. And that's really important. I always have to stress that because people read my diet paper, then they have these 2 questions, which seemingly easy. But then if you don't know all the context and how to do it, it can really go wrong.
Right. So if you just tried to implement that without any context holding, I could see that would become pretty difficult.
Yeah. And so we did that in Resource, and we were amazed because people said, again, you are crazy, Tania. Are you totally, not only that you ask people 9 months to do 30 minutes every day and then retreats and all that crazy stuff in 90 measures, but diets with someone they don't know every day per app, and they have to tell private stuff to someone they don't know every day over months, you will have dropout rate of 70%. I mean, that was what I heard all the time. And I said, let's see.
Yeah.
And we had a dropout rate less than 8% after 9 months.
Wow. Yeah. And this was done by like an app or like on the phone, basically, is how people would share?
We had an app who was like, timing, 1 minute silence, 2.5 minutes, first question, thank you, silence, 2.5 minutes. So we had it's really like a very structured contemplative exercise, and the app runs you through. Having said that, after the success of Resource and all the other project and diet projects, I developed next to my work to bring it into society, masterclass and retreats. And there I don't have an app, right? And we are doing it just by phone, and we are doing a mouth gong. We are doing gong. I'm watching the time, gong.
Okay.
Right? And it works too. So the app is super because we use the app to do science, to measure before, after event sampling and so on.
Right.
It helps giving you timing and really also making sure. So for scientific research, you need an app. You can't do it. But if you just implement these programs as I do next to my work, I don't need an app, actually, honestly.
Yeah.
You can do low tech.
Yeah, that's great. So what are some of the areas that you've been applying this now outside of the research context? I know you've been really interested in kind of moving it into society.
Yeah, so in a way, after research was such a success, I started really becoming interested in diets, because I was like, wow, they are really efficient and they are like social glue, right? People really become like sanghas, like social families. And very quickly, it is amazing what it does to people, and people like it and they really do them every day and they love them and they get almost addicted to them. I mean, not every, but a lot. So then the COVID pandemic came, right?
Yes.
And we couldn't do any retreats, in-person stuff anymore. So we did a pandemic study where we tracked thousands of Berliners, randomly chosen from City Register, and we tracked their mental health, social cohesion, resilience throughout the lockdowns. And what we observed in the study was, oh my God, they're suffering like hell.
Yeah.
Especially in the second 6 months lockdown. I mean, boy, especially young and women, but everyone, isolation went up, loneliness went up crazy for young people. And we could see depression, went up, anxiety went up. Of course, there were also resilient pockets, right? There's always both. But on average, you could see that. So in the second phase, we said, instead of just continuing seeing how the Berliners suffer more and more, get more and more depressed, lonely, and so on, let's do something to help. We have these diets and we have mindfulness exercise. So what we did for the first time, use our app only online, only 10 weeks, not like 9 months again, right? 10 weeks, just online, just one group does 12 minutes diet, so 13 minutes diet. The other group does 13 minutes of mindfulness exercise. Classic breathing, body scan, mindfulness. Yeah.
Individual practice.
Individual practice, and the other we're doing an affect diet, 12 minutes. Same teacher, same coaching session lengths every week, same app. Just the practice was different. One was the affect diet with a partner. The other is lonely mindfulness exercise as we know it. And so the first time we could compare, right? And it was really exciting after 10 weeks just online, because we wanted to know, can we scale these programs?
Yeah.
Because, resource 9 months, nobody can do that in schools and healthcare and so on. And online you can scale. So we were super surprised. It really worked out well. We have, I think, now 12 papers out of Cough Social Project. And they really, really showed first, what we could show is that we could replicate mindfulness results in the domain of, 10 weeks online mindfulness, but also diets. This is a common effect. Could reduce depression, could reduce anxiety. But when you looked at other measures, the diets were more efficient when it came to the social domain. So they were more efficient to increase compassion when you measure it not by question, but objectively, by task, right? They were more efficient to increase resilience, optimism, and also computer task-based positivity bias or negativity bias. So meaning you can measure our faculty to see the world, the glass half full or the glass half empty.
Oh, okay.
You can measure that through very intelligent computer tasks where you don't even know that you measure this tendency. And this is called negativity bias. And people with a strong negativity bias tend to see the world in a negative way. And this also predicts whether you can develop depression later or not, right?
Right.
And the diet, because of the gratitude probably, the second question is like, focusing on gratitude every day, really increased optimism and the positivity bias, right? It really made people less negatively biased. And it also increased more compassion and social cohesion and closeness and the feeling, of being connected with others. And it was also more efficient in actually reducing social stress. And we had seen that in the resource project. But in the resource project, we didn't know, was it the diet or was it the combination with all the other meditation which were opening the heart? We didn't know.
Yeah.
And now we could the first time replicate that when you do a Trier social stress test, you stress people socially in the lab, you measure the hormones, the cortisol hormone, only the diet, but not the mindfulness, can reduce the cortisol level response to social stress, right? And we have now replicated, and it's very clear. And this is amazing, given that a lot of people, say umbrella term mindfulness, right, is reducing stress. if you look in different measures of stress, it's not true. You can find it on questionnaire, but when it's about the social stress, right? Feeling not adequate, not feeling good enough, feeling judged, feeling, all the social judgments we have, the social stress we, because of the other. Only when you do diets, which is kind of teaching you every day, no? You train also not to judge the other, not to be judged, to be listened, non-judgmental. So in a way, you train not to be afraid anymore, to not, of the other and of the judgment of the other. So you are kind of every day, you are making yourself immune against this fear of judgment of the other. And that brings down social stress on the hormonal level to 51%. So, and only dietic work can do that, right? At least after 10 weeks, I don't know, So we had a lot of these very positive outcomes for the diet. So we said, okay, next step, we have to bring it into schools, into healthcare system, and we have to do what I call translational social neuroscience now, right? It's not social neuroscience in the lab foundational, but it's like, can we do science now in the fields? Like, can we bring diet programs to teachers and then measure how they actually run their class? How, this changed the system in which they work, or, their perception of their colleagues. And this is the Edu Social School project we're just running. So we have hundreds of teachers learning diets. And it's very, very touching. They need it a lot. It was the most difficult population to recruit ever.
Wow.
I never had so much difficulty to recruit. They are just, after the pandemic, school teacher burning out like flies, totally overwhelmed. I don't know in US, but at least the meta-analysis showed the same in US, right?
Yeah.
But once they are in, once they have said, okay, I take the time for myself, right, to learn, they are totally amazed by the effect of the diet and the support it gives them. It's very, very touching.
Oh, that's great.
We have not looked at the data,
I was going to say, I would imagine then you can look at outcomes in the school setting and things like that to look at kind of the systems level.
Yeah.
That's really, it's so inspiring. I love how, looking at the scope of your work over the decades has really shifted so much from, or it's always been the intent to kind of bring it more into the interpersonal and social realm. And I feel like it's just been so beautiful to see also the field following that trajectory too, of moving from a focus on the individual, starting now to think more and more about how did these practices change, communities, societies, systems, and all the questions that go around that. And it's beautiful to see your work moving in that direction too.
And I realized when we did meta-analysis on, how much has actually been done, in system level change in science, right? Like from individual to system level change, we absolutely have no idea of how they actually relate, no individual change in system.
Right.
And why I also figured there is actually not a lot of good task paradigm measures out there to measure system level change not just by a questionnaire, but some objective marker. There is really poor
measures.
Measures in science. And it reminds me when we started, doing resource project, we also had to come up with all the new paradigms actually, because there was no training research in this domain, right? So we had to, the first 3 years of resource was to create paradigm, which we could use over longitudinal change to measure empathy, theory of mind, compassion, all these things. Now we have them, we replicate, they are in use. But I think now our field, the next, boundary we need to push is to come up with good system measures, which are objective and telling you something, so that we can move from the question of how does individual change relates to system change and really measure and make science out of it, right? And we try that now in school context. We have good ideas. We will see how that works out. But there is a whole new field basically to be invented. I would love to see something like translational social or contemplative neuroscience to come out, no?
Yeah.
As a new field, as a new goal.
Right. Yeah. Oh, well, Tania, this has been really so wonderful to chat. And I just love hearing the breadth of your work. And it's had so much impact, both in the field and in the world. So is there anything you want to share, like any big picture take homes as we're wrapping up?
Yeah, I think perhaps one thing I missed to say, it's because of the political situation of the world. No, it's in a very, very, very bad state at the moment. I mean, very dark state of the world. And the amount of polarization, no, and the amount of hate speech and, the divides are tremendous, no? Also the divides of rich and poor. And so I think that the field now of social neuroscience, contemplative science, needs to become more translational to really bring what we have developed in the lab and is working into the society at large, so that we can really counteract that, right? Because it is undermining our democracies, it is undermining our humanity. We have a loneliness epidemic already in young people, and I think we have a responsibility to do something about it. And so, diets is, of course, just a little mini solution, but at least it helps. It's a bit like piecework, right? Because people really learn to listen across boundary, across ages, across divides, across in-group, out-group, and to really, come to a sense of shared humanity and connect, like interdependence. And I think we really, really, really need to bring that very early into schools again, and to really bring people into these vulnerable dialogues again, so that we can avoid getting in this narcissistic trap, which a lot of social media are actually fostering right now, right?
Yeah, right.
This is like, I have to be beautiful, I have to be super, I have to be perfect, I have to have millions of followers, I have to be liked by thousands. But if you are ill, it's not your followers who will bring you the chicken soup, right? If you feel ugly or in puberty, it's not these people who are your friends, no? So I guess there is a lot to do, which is really not just staying in your lab, but really, translating these approaches to really support society and democracy right now. And that's where my heart is really going at the moment.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Tania, for taking the time today, and for all of your work and all of the ways that you're showing up. So.
And thank you, Wendy, for doing this podcast. You're really presenting this whole field to the big world, right? So you are big in the business of translating this knowledge to a broad audience. Thank you so much for doing that.
Well, it's a joy. Thank you, Tania.
Thank you.
This episode was edited and produced by me and Phil Walker, and music on the show is from Blue Dot Sessions and Universal. Show notes and resources for this and other episodes can be found at podcast.mindandlife.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and share it with a friend. And if something in this conversation sparked insight for you, let us know. You can send an email or voice memo to podcast@mindandlife.org. Mind and Life is a production of the Mind and Life Institute. Visit us at mindandlife.org, where you can learn more about how we bridge science and contemplative wisdom to foster insight and inspire action towards flourishing. If you value these conversations, please consider supporting the show. You can make a donation at mindandlife.org under support. Any amount is so appreciated, and it really helps us create this show. Thank you for listening.